Well, thank you again so much for joining for the first session. And I have to say, I was just reflecting a lot on that break on all that we learned from our three panelists. So it's really a treat and important to be learning about the youth juvenile justice system and the context and the information. So what we wanted to do was give you a chance to share some reflections and connections on what you learned, and then a chance to ask more questions of the panelists, because we only got one question before the break. So before we dive into questions, just to give people a chance to process, I'm going to share my screen again, just for a moment. We're going to put you into breakout rooms for just 5 minutes and just share some reflections, something surprising you learned or something compelling that you learned, something that makes you think about things in a new way, and a question you have that you may want to ask the panelists. And when we come back after you've done those reflections, we'll open up for further Q&A. And I see that some more people have put questions in the chat as well. But again, just a chance for you to share reflections and do some verbal talking with each other, and then we'll move into the Q&A. So I'm going to send you into breakout rooms. I know since we did introductions at the start, we had a few people who have joined. So, please make sure to share your names as well if you haven't already. And here are I'm putting in the chat your discussion questions. We will see you in a few minutes. So again, just sharing what's something you learned that's surprising or compels you, something that makes you think about things in a new way, and a question you have that you want to engage with the panel. And we'll see you in a moment. So I hope that little time to just talk in small groups was helpful to start to make meaning from the incredible wealth of information we learned this morning. So I do want to open it now up to further questions and answers. And I don't know even if, Tinia, that conversation you were just having, if that might be something of interest to the full group. But I want to, so we could start there if you want. And if not, there are some questions that we can start in with the chat. And then again, I invite people to put further questions in the chat, and we'll invite you to share them. So I see, Lou, you have a question about for-profit centers. So Lou, I don't know if you want to unmute yourself and share what your question is to the panel.
Yeah, sure. I was just wondering if you think there's been any impact from for-profit youth centers as far as the length of time, especially hearing what you said. They're really in control of when that youth gets let out and when they are pulled back in or whatever. So do you think that's made any difference?
That's a really good question. And honestly, I think it's a political one that I'm not sure if I'm equipped to fully answer as to whether it's made a significant difference. I can tell you that throughout my career and working in this field, I've heard grumbling when juvenile arrests go down. And that to me is concerning because, and I've heard this even from, police departments, from, a lot of different, players, but including DYS. I have heard, like, if there are no juveniles to place in custody, right? Like, are they going to lose their jobs, or, people concerned about, again, like a for-profit jail system, and do they have quotas? Right now, it's something I can share afterwards, but I was reading an article about where Boston police had the body cameras during the protesting, like back on May 31st, while they were responding to the Black Lives Matter movement right here in Boston. A lot of them left their body cameras on. And so we were able, through our office, CPC, well, actually, one of the attorneys that used to work for our office, he was able to to ask for that evidence to be released to him through a case that he had from representing one of the clients who was a protester. And in that evidence, the body cameras came out, and one of them was talking about arrest quotas, basically. And this is on public news right now because it's for adults. And, you know, they had like, you know, to arrest, they had enough space for 10 people. And so at the end, he was saying, well, they thought they had 10, like something like we met our quota, but then all of a sudden there was only 9. And he was like, well, I guess we could have gotten 10, but it'll be all right. We'll stick with 9 today, you know? So to answer your question, it's somewhat political because I don't think there's specific data on, you know, it's another project to try to get deeper answers. But I will say that it is disturbing that the prison system is for profit and that people do consider, like, you know, their jobs and salary. Whereas in my mind, I do feel like we need to operate like this isn't a job I would recommend for anyone. I want someone to get me out of this job. I would prefer to be a teacher, a professor at a college, or to do something that really you can help educate people, or even like we can envision a new system where our jobs are not needed anymore. And so for people to be thinking about, oh, there's lower arrests, you know, especially during this pandemic too, like, oh, we're not arresting enough people, or there's so many beds available and people might, you know, we might have to downsize and lose their job. Like, that's the least of our worries. That's a good thing. Like, if there's another way to channel handling delinquency behavior and supporting youth and people in general.
Might I comment on for-profit? That's the worst thing we could ever do, because the owners make all the money, and the online staff are paid nothing, and so you have huge numbers of untrained people there. There's so much data about untrained and even suicidal behavior in for-profit prisons. It happens in the public sector too. You know, there's suicides in DYS. We know that. It's, you know, it's broken completely. And the public sector is broken, and the private sector has no business doing that. Because there's information where judges funnel kids to private prisons. It's like, you know, how many more can we have? You know, find us, you know, give us you know, a commitment. It's ridiculous. You know, pure and simple.
John, thank you for sharing. And I know, you know, as you shared in the chat, that you have, you know, your own expertise in the area that you're bringing to this. So thank you for that. I definitely saw some nods as you were talking as well. Bonnie has a question, and you put a link which we can share if you'd like. We can share the screen to that. Bonnie, do you want to unmute yourself and share your question?
Sure. I'm still getting familiar with the youth court sort of practice that's starting to take shape around the nation. And I haven't been trained in it, but I'm working with a specialist who has. And locally here in Salem, the League of Women Voters has been looking into this as something that we could develop, but we're still looking for a lot of feedback to see if this is actually something that folks would support and think is actually a solution. It's really supposed to focus around restorative justice and like a solution for diverting folks outside of this pipeline. It's difficult to put in practice, I think, because you need a lot of higher stakeholders to support it. You need officers to defer people to this program versus the traditional program. You need the local courts to support it. So I just would be curious to know if anyone's heard about it or has anything to say about it.
I have. I don't know, Eliza, have you had to? I know there's a program in New Bedford right now that does it. It's the only program I know that is actually active in Massachusetts, but I also know that I think internationally this has become more popular, and we have a national team that works on this in other states. I myself I brought it up a few times. I've even brought it up to the DA's office to consider, but I just need a lot more training in it because we don't have one that exists. Like I know of it and I think it's an amazing idea. I just haven't seen one operate locally. And I've been curious to go to New Bedford to see like how it works over there. My understanding is the police department definitely has a big buy-in, at least in the one in New Bedford, from what I've heard, and I don't know how active it is or if it's thriving or not.
Yeah, and I like the idea of it. I think that they have to figure out how it would work in practice. I know that when restorative justice practices have happened in court, they can be very powerful. I can remember a case where it resolved after having all the defendant, the alleged victim, their parents, the assistant district attorney was in the room, I was in the room, and they had a counselor there and allowed the kids to talk and share what happened. And I think we didn't know what was going to happen because these two individuals had recently gotten into a serious fight. But it was very powerful, and it was, there was some reconciliation that happened. So I think people are sometimes hesitant about those situations because they don't know if it's going to result in another fight or another incident, but they can be very powerful.
I wanted to share something that I didn't, because of time, wasn't able to share quickly. And just so that you guys know, on the sentencing issue that I do think is really important, that for juveniles, their adjudications, which they call it, which is basically like a conviction for a juvenile. I think the court has tried to make a distinguishing factor between juveniles being convicted versus adults. But the reality is for adults, there exists an armed career criminal statute, which is kind of like a 3 strikes you're outlaw, like they're with mandatory sentencing. So like your first offense for the felony charges under the armed career criminal statute, they can face up to, let's say 18 months in custody. Then it goes up to 3 years, 10 years, 15 years by their third or strike. So the reality is, and that's 15 years mandatory by the third strike. So 2 years ago, and in a SJC case, the court also found that the juvenile convictions, adjudications, which they usually want to call them, can be used as a predicate offense for armed career criminal statute, meaning that if a juvenile is convicted of a firearm charge, that's qualified under that section, that can be used as one of the predicate offenses. And if they have 2 of them, it can be used as 2. So if you have a juvenile with 2 convictions of possession firearm, when they become 18, 19, if they pick up a third one, that can be used to give them like a mandatory minimum of 10 years in state prison or 15 years. So this is why when Mar-Sophia brought up the most recent case where the court decided it didn't want to give juveniles enough credit for any time that they serve while their case is pending in jail. Like they can spend 6 months, let's say, in the juvenile jail, and the court decided it's not going to credit those 6 months when it gives them the final penalty. For adults, they do credit those 6 months. So it's interesting though, it's like, oh no, well for juveniles, this should be different. We're not going to credit that time because they're juveniles, and in the juvenile jail, they're getting like education and treatment. However, when it came to whether or not they qualified for armed career criminal statute, they did choose to consider that, oh, they're juveniles, even though they're young and they're teens, it doesn't matter. Their conviction, adjudication, quote unquote, is going to count And so that means they now are exposed to the same minimum mandatory sentences as adults, even if they committed a crime when they were under 18. And I think that's really important for people to know, and wanted to share that part.
Migdalia, thank you for sharing that. You had shared that when we were doing a pre-meeting, a little bit of that, and that like totally stunned me. And I personally had no idea about that. There's a few more questions in the chat, and also some comments. So please keep the chat going as well with comments. Let's see, it looks like, and Eliza has been answering some of the questions as well. So Lou, John, and Lise have kind of engaged in commentary. I don't know if any of you want to share that question out loud. The original question was about if some program could be started with schools that raised awareness of what happens when a youth gets into the system and all the collateral damages that occur and are lifelong.
So I'll address that. I addressed it a little bit in the chat, but my office has done what we call Know the Laws. Sometimes in schools, it's not really a formal program, but sort of in collaboration with various schools in our area, we'll go in and talk to students, not just about what happens when you go into the system, but also explaining, why you shouldn't talk to the police when they ask you questions, explaining, what your rights are if you do get arrested and things like that. And I think those can be really useful. And I really appreciate Lisa's comment about not doing it in a way that's scary. And also, so I'm trying to read as I talk, Lou's comment about not singling out youth at risk. And I think that going into the schools can be a really great way to do that, because you can just speak to a class, not to, a group of specific kids. And I think some sort of formal programming that does that would be really great, because obviously we sort of just go in when a teacher or a principal has the thought that it might be useful to have us there.
Can I ask a question about that? Because as you're talking, I'm picturing this at my school. Is there, do you include anything about how kids can advocate to make change? Or like, and is there, I would be interested, if we were going to have a program like that at my school, I would want there to be them to have the opportunity to engage in some sort of activism, like not just this is what would happen to you if you're bad, but this is what you as a teenager can do to push against the system or to advocate or.
I think that's an awesome question. And the times that we have gone in, it's been really focused on sort of explaining the law as it is. I think, in collaboration with a school, we would be more than happy to talk about what kind of advocacy is available, or what kids could think about doing, or what we do advocacy wise. It just isn't something, again, it hasn't been something that's been set up. So I think that's a great thing moving forward that we could work on.
And then when I worked in Essex County, we worked with a middle school in Salem for a period of, I believe, 10 weeks, and worked on different topics with a middle school class. And they worked on, they learned about what a trial was, what an attorney was, and we had different topics that they could debate and talk about. So that was a little unique way to have discussions with youth, but that was a one-time thing. I don't even think after that year they went back, because it takes a lot of time, but it was a great program to interact with the middle schoolers there at that time.
And I would give kudos to BDL, because I think that one of the ways to show kids that they can be a part of this is showing them advocacy. So that's why the Boston Debate League, this organization is crucial, because I've often coached mock trial, like that's what, coming from the inner city myself and public school system where I felt like there was a lot of chaos around me. The mock trial program at my high school was what really propelled me to become active and really, so for one, I think the education piece is important. Like, how can you want to become involved if you don't even know a problem exists? So what we try to do with Know the Laws is like teach you, like, this is the problem that exists. So it's not more like, oh, we want you to know this is what will happen to you if you do this. It's more like, we want you to know, like, look at what's happening around you. And this is to your age group, your population. And because the juvenile court is confidential, you won't ever know this is happening unless you have a family member that's involved, because you won't ever be allowed in the courtroom. So most people don't know, and they don't see, like, we see kids with shackles on their feet, shackles on their hands. We see what you saw in that video every day when we go through juvenile court, and the kids also go through strip searches every time they come in and out. There's a lot that is seen that the kids don't know about. And so once you unveil like what's happening, some of the kids spark their interest, like, how can I get involved? And that's when it's like, you know what? Join the Boston Debate League, join a mock trial program. Anyone who's involved with the school, I think mock trial and debate really teaches kids how to learn about an issue and then learn how to advocate and use your voice to change that. And that's how they can learn, like, you can become a state representative, like get involved in the local government in some way, join someone's campaign. And that's a way, changing legislation is how this is going to really change. And Leon brought this same question up, so kind of answering both. Hopefully you see, Leon, an answer to your question from the breakout group as well. Like, he wanted to focus on, like, okay, what can we do? And it's like, the judges are just applying the law as it is, and they sometimes interpret what they believe legislation is intending, but at the end of the day, it's legislation, and it's like the people who vote and need to be aware of the issues that they're voting on.
Migdalia, thank you also for that connection about the BDL. And actually, I'll share that, speaking of advocacy, that one of the debaters from Brighton High School named Phoebe Ogunsanwo is leading an event immediately after this conference called Let's Talk About Black Women, which she's the organizer of. She partnered with Black Boston as well as the Boston Debate League, and is bringing together a great panel of speakers and musical guests. And that's an example of hopefully where the power of debate moves to then the power of advocacy. And the other thing I just wanted to share, just from my own reflections when we were talking about restorative justice, is that separate from an explicit connection to the criminal justice system, restorative justice is a practice that I have observed growing and taking hold in various schools in Boston public schools. That there's restorative justice partners and coaches that come in and train teachers, and that they'll do restorative justice circles, so that there are schools that have that partnership. So that I just think is interesting to maybe throw into the mix as we think about what systemic change looks like on the youth, on the juvenile like justice system as well. I want to highlight, is it Autume, the Goddess in Green LLC?
Yes, hi.
Thank you. Do you want to share a comment about that you put in the chat there?
Oh, I had so many thoughts. Sorry. Specifically, I live in New Bedford. I'm originally from Denver, Colorado. So I've got to see city to city the disproportionate, inequities. Not only that, but I've lived through them, and I'm no longer a statistic. So just living through it, having teens, being a young mom, they ask for more training in school. They're not given a lot of options, especially in places like New Bedford High School. I know there's like the vocational schools. However, these children need somebody to show them what that kind of looks like in a nutshell, as opposed to them seeing their parents make that choices and live that life, continuing the patterns, that's been set up for them.
Thank you. We appreciate you sharing your experiences also, as well as your reflections.
Yes, thank you so much. I'm gonna mute now.
Awesome. So I'm curious if any panelists have responses to that. And then what I'd say is we can take 1 or 2 more questions, and then we're going to move into a conversation thinking about the changes that people were starting to talk about.
I definitely think that the job opportunity and job training thing is a huge piece of it. And I'll just give a shout out to a local group that we work with a lot called More Than Words, that does a lot of work with youth in our area, gives them, it's a bookstore, and they have an online bookstore, online component as well, but they give the kids jobs and training, and more programs like that would be amazing, because it really gives the kids a sense of responsibility, gives them a lot of training, and pays them. And, you know, paying kids for their time and the effort that they're putting in is a huge motivating factor, and really helps kids, you know, sort of take responsibility for what they're doing, and also get to see that reward that a lot of times they don't get in other places. So I appreciate that comment.
Awesome. Leo, you had a comment. Do you want to share that aloud?
Oh, sure. So I'm 19. I'm a sophomore in college at BU. And when I was thinking about, well, back in high school, when I was thinking about what I wanted to do, a big part of it was looking at the news and seeing how I think the political system has really failed us as Americans, and especially for the youth, I think, in this era. So I think a big part of moving forward is better legislation, more clarity, and more transparency in you know, policies and ways to really help our communities and empower children. So that's just just a small comment I want to make.
Thank you for sharing that. Again, I'm seeing a lot of nods of affirmation to that thought as well. Well, what I'd like us to do, and so some virtual thumbs up as well. What I'd like us to do now, and panelists, just for transparency, actually for everyone, we had planned originally to do a mini debate on a question about whether prisons should exist, but in part to be responsive to where this conversation is going, we'd actually like to give people a chance to think about, I'm sorry, the mini debate was going to be, should prisons exist for young people, which is a compelling and existing debate that is really happening now. And certainly that can be one that we can be weighing and thinking about. What we'd actually like to do, though, is give you a chance to really think about just changes even more holistically to the system, whether it is about abolishing prison for juveniles or thinking about changes to sentencing, or some of these programs that people are talking about around restorative justice, jobs, looking at the collateral consequences. And so we're going to give you a chance to go into breakout rooms. I'm going to share my screen again. And these are just prompts for you to start to think about these things. And I'm going to share this PowerPoint because you as a group you'll have editing access. You can kind of take notes in this slide. So if you're in group 1, you'll be on slide 18. I'll share this in a moment. But you can reflect on how should the system be different? What actually should change? Whether it's prisons should exist or not exist for juveniles, or whether it's thinking about other processes like we talked about, the restorative justice process, or the jobs, the different pieces. What should we change first? What do you think is most urgent? What do you think is the hardest thing to change? And the change that you think would make the biggest difference. And so in each of the rooms, there will be a panelist, so an expert to share their own wisdom as well. But I know there's a lot of wisdom just in this room from different experiences that people are bringing. So you will have a chance to share and reflect. And again, feel free to put your notes in the PowerPoint slides. So you can take a look in the chat and open that up. and you'll go to either slide 18, 19, or 20 and kind of take notes. And then when we come back, we'll be able to share out and see what each group is reflecting on, what changes do need to happen. Are there any questions about what we'll be about to do? Okay. All right. With that, I will send us to our breakout rooms. Welcome back. Hello. How was that time? Was that useful and productive? Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you for engaging in that sort of forward-looking conversation. What we'd like to do in this we have about 10 minutes or so before it's time to transition back to the auditorium, where we'll hear from our keynote speaker, Rachel Rollins. Before we do that, we have time really to share out what each group was thinking. And so I can share my screen again so we can look at some of the what people wrote down. And if we want, it looks like group 2, I may have labeled it in a strange order, but it looks like group 2 is on this slide here. Would 1 or 2 volunteers from group 2 want to share out what did you all talk about, and what are some changes that you envisioned?
I think the thing that was the most interesting is like there's no silver bullet, there's no easy solution. So changing first starts with listening. That was my big takeaway.
Thank you, Julie. Does anyone else from group 2 want to add on?
My thought was to shift resources from the prisons to greater resources within the community. That includes education, job training, working in collaboration with schools, that type of thing.
Thank you. And that definitely came up even in the Q&A, those sorts of collaborations, whether formal or informal. Mm-hmm. So let's share, moving on to group 1. If any representatives from group 1 want to share what you all talked about.
Well, we talked about, I think we were having some problem with other people writing on our slide, I don't know, but anyway, so everything didn't get down there, but we did talk about restorative practices. We talked about the problem of implicit bias, and that being a real issue. And definitely we thought we could, there should be more discussion in the schools about the consequences in the justice system in general. And, that might be something that would help every child to understand what happens and how the justice system works and what happens and why it's important. For instance, somebody brought up why it's important to not talk, police when you're arrested and all, and the consequences. So, yeah, it was hard to say what we would change first because they're so important, all of them. So we didn't get into those last couple of questions so much.
We talked, Autumn talked about, Autumn, do you want to talk about what you?
Yeah, I think the hardest thing to change would be the system that was already built. I think a lot of differences would come out of that.
Yeah, I think like we talked about, well, Autumn, you talked about the culture of school and about how education is really a privilege in this country and how people are shut out of it for various reasons, from learning disability to culture. And also we talked about how the criminal justice system is designed to perpetuate white supremacy from its origin, and our educational system is designed from its origin to create a compliant workforce. So the culture of education that is so totally focused on behavior management and compliance intersects with criminal justice system that's designed to uphold racism. So it's like two structures that both need to be dismantled at their very, like their roots. That's why we couldn't figure out what to write on our slide, because it was too much.
Too much and not so simple. And that really, for me, makes the connections back to the video that we saw at the beginning, the systemic roots and the intentionality of that from its inception. Thank you for sharing. Anyone else from group one want to add on to that?
I think a lot in the systemic, a lot really goes into mental health, you know, just well-being altogether. If we look back in history, we could just look at health and mental health and stuff like that and just correlate it to today, you know what I mean? And just the same, and then we're constantly in a chaos rather than getting out of that.
Thank you, Autumn. Well, let's build on that and move into group three. Can we have one or two representatives share what your group talked about?
I can go. So I think a big part of what we talked about was rehabilitation over punishment. Really getting to the root cause of why these institutes were created in the first place, right? To move from that sort of punishing people for doing the wrong thing to more of a re-education and better programs. And I think for me personally, one of the largest problems is profiteering off, you know, people and minorities and POCs who are much more in disadvantaged communities, who are born into these situations, and they are not people who should be profited off of. It's just wrong. And for young people in particular, when you institute these kind of terrible ideas and concepts into your lives at those young stages, it lives with them for a very long time, and it impacts their life in the wrong way. So like what we talked about was a lot of just lots of, I think, emphasis on mental health and differentiating juveniles from adults. So that's kind of my point of view.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. Does anyone from, and I see that Autumn was affirming that as well. And to me, I was feeling absolute connections to what you were saying to the earlier conversation about the systems. Anyone else from group three want to add on?
I will say, I know we had a few members, including Bonnie and others, that talked about how important it was to listen and kind of educate themselves on the topic as well. So I think I appreciated that comment about, you know, wanting to be here to listen and learn as well.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Migdalia. And that's really a good segue because we are just a few minutes before we need to close and head back to the auditorium. But that comment, Migdalia, that you just made, again, I just really want to name and celebrate that all of us who are here today are doing that. That's in the spirit of our own growing education and awareness. I'm incredibly grateful to the people who are dedicating their lives to making the system better, whether it's bit by bit or whether it's seeking larger system change. And it just, you have our admiration and gratitude as a society, and I also speak personally for myself. So first, I do want to, again, thank our three attorney panelists. So we have Tinia Snow and Migdalia Nalls and Eliza Lockhart Jenks. So please unmute yourselves, show some love for them for being here on a Saturday.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And any closing remarks that you three want to make before we transition back to our keynote address? All right, well, thank you again. I hope that this was of value for those who came. And what's going to happen now, the link back to the auditorium is in the chat. So we'll be hearing the address from District Attorney Rachel Rollins. So hope you're able to stay on for that as well. And thanks again for coming out on a Saturday to give your time to engage in this learning.